DMT, N-bomb, LSD, magic mushrooms. No matter what name or form you recognize it in, we all know, at least on some level, that psychedelics exist, even if some of us have only ever seen them on TV. Recently, there's been a surge in media coverage of these drugs, and not in the say no to drugs kids kind of way that we're so used to. These articles are claiming that psychedelics can cure depression. To know whether or not there's any truth to that statement, we must first answer the question, what are psychedelics?
Psychedelic means mind manifesting. Sometimes they used to be called hallucinogens because they also make people hallucinate, especially visual hallucinations. People on psychedelics often see unusual things. And when they look out at the world, they see illusions, walls breathe and the sky is full of diamonds, that sort of stuff. So psychedelics are drugs that are characterized by their ability to produce these really powerful psychoactive effects, meaning that when you take them within a fairly short period of time, your perceptions, your emotions, a bunch of stuff changes rather radically. And there are a couple of classes of them. There's things called classic psychedelics. Those are drugs that have a very specific effect on a certain type of serotonin receptor in the brain. It's called the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor.
So how do psychedelics work? What do they do to the brain? To understand that, we're going to need a quick crash course on the default mode network. The default mode network is a network of interacting regions of the brain that is active when a person is not focused on the outside world, but more so on themselves. It's this series of midline brain structures that are active when you're daydreaming, or just existing.
They discovered it in a scanner because they noticed that, they put you in a brain scanner and make you do something like recognize faces and stuff. But between times, you're just sitting there. The brain doesn't die. It does something. And what it does is activate the default mode network, which some people have said is sort of like the seat of the ego or the seat of the self. It very much has to do with sort of placing the self in space and time in relation to other people.
The receptor, when activated, is it actually leads to deactivation of certain routing hubs in the brain. So the brain kind of routes information through it in somewhat predictable ways through these sort of hub structures that exist in the default mode network. So those routing structures, probably the best metaphor that I've heard is kind of looking at like an airline map. If you see an airline map, like if you want to go from point A to point B, you might have to go through a connecting city because there's no direct route between those two cities. And so these routing structures sort of act like those connecting cities. So there's similar structures that exist in the brain. And those structures under psilocybin seem to go offline. They stop doing their job in the same way that they typically do when you're not under drug. And so what that results in is sort of weird activity in the brain for the duration of the drug, that the information will route in ways that are somewhat unpredictable.
When you give someone a psychedelic, the internal structure of those brain hubs breaks down and they reach out and they start forming new networks with other parts of the brain. So you have this expanded diversity of networks, brain network connections in the brain.
This might be why you get things like synesthesia under psychedelics. You might see music as a color, for example. So that might be your auditory cortex and your visual cortex having conversations with each other that they don't normally have. So that might be part of what's happening there. That's a sort of a rough idea of how psilocybin and LSD work. MDMA has a different mechanism of action that is largely a releaser of serotonin and to a lesser extent, prolactin and oxytocin. And that increased release of serotonin is also sort of seems to deactivate a key structure in the brain called the amygdala, which is involved in detecting danger and is very active when we are fearful. Also, it's very active when we're depressed. And by decreasing the activity of the amygdala, that fear response that is characteristic of talking about trauma may be decreased, which makes processing trauma more tolerable. So that's an example of how a couple of different drugs work. They're very different in their mechanism of action. And even though they're both referred to as psychedelics,
we all have a default mode network. We all daydream and we all think about ourselves. Many of us even have an internal monologue. But people with depression tend to have higher connectivity in their default mode network. What this means in practice is that people suffering from depression tend to be more self-focused, in the sense that they are way more critical of themselves. Their life, their flaws, and their failures are constantly on full blast in their brains. This high connectivity of the default mode network leads to something that is a huge symptom and cause of depression: rumination. Rumination is this never-ending cycle of negative thinking, often repeating the same thoughts over and over again.
So what this might translate into clinically is somebody with depression might spend a lot of their day thinking about how sort of terrible they are, but not be able to get around to answering their emails or write a term paper.
Now that we have all that technical jargon out of the way, and hopefully have a solid grip on the mechanics of these drugs, it's time to look at how psychedelics can treat depression. Not much research has been conducted on this topic yet, but what we do know comes from the few studies that have taken place so far. These studies are usually small-scale clinical trials in which participants are given a psychedelic, such as psilocybin, which is found in the drug colloquially known as magic mushrooms. The effect on these participants' depression symptoms is recorded in comparison to participants who were given a placebo.
There are a number of small studies and recently a much, much larger study done showing that a single dose of a psychedelic, psilocybin, in this case, when given at a high dose that produces a very powerful psychedelic experience, when that happens, many, many people who are very depressed and many people who have failed regular old antidepressants get a very rapid, rather powerful antidepressant effect that tends to last for a prolonged period. People take one dose and feel better for weeks to months, which is quite striking, right? And how that is and why a single dose of a medicine that leaves your body in 8 hours can make you undepressed for 3 or 4 months is a mystery.
For a brief period of time, it kind of turns down actually all activity in the brain, which was a surprising finding because the effects of psilocybin are so vivid that the expectation would be there would be more activity in the brain. But it turns out the overall activity in the brain actually comes down, but the default mode network really reduces inactivity. And when the drug wears off, there seems to be some kind of a possible reset that's happening there. It's not fully understood what exactly happens as a result of the psilocybin, but it does appear that the psilocybin supported by therapy can confer this antidepressant effect. Psychedelics are different than conventional pharmacology that we use to, say, treat depression, in that they are taken usually only a few times, maybe even once or twice, as opposed to taking something on a daily basis like one would do with a conventional antidepressant. And so that's one significant way that they are different.
I mean, what's unusual about psychedelics, particularly LSD, is these drugs are so active at such low doses. We're talking about micrograms. Most medical drugs are measured in milligrams, thousands of a gram, and this is in micro doses. Sort of, they're tiny amounts that produce these effects.
Conventional antidepressants certainly can be helpful for reducing some symptoms, but they incur other challenges such as your conventional side effects that come from taking a medication on a daily basis. But more subtly, there's some that would say that they actually kind of reduce emotional range, and that for some people is not desired. So they might not feel as depressed, but they might not feel as much of anything. Psychedelics, by contrast, tend to amplify emotional experiences, certainly during the duration of the drug effects. And that gives an opportunity to work with some of those things therapeutically.
So fortunately, psychedelics are not particularly dangerous in overdose. In other words, it's pretty hard to kill yourself with a psychedelic by poisoning yourself. People have estimated you need to eat like a pound or two or more of mushrooms to kill yourself. I mean, they really are pretty safe that way.
Despite these reported benefits, there is a lot of uncertainty behind whether psychedelics can cure depression that stems from the inadequacy of research. The studies conducted were small, and the participants used in them volunteered to be there. This means that they brought their preconceived notions about the effects of psychedelics on depression into the study. This is known as volunteer bias, and it lowers the reliability of these studies. Furthermore, despite the presence of a placebo group, the participants are aware that they are being given a psychedelic, and the resulting placebo effect may also interfere with the results of these studies.
It's hard to find a placebo for a psychedelic. They've done some different tricks. One thing that they did at Johns Hopkins was they used a low dose of psilocybin, like 1 milligram versus 25 milligrams, which would be a standard effective dose.
Psychedelics have gone from being sort of these dangerous drugs now to people thinking it's their last and only hope, right? So people are so desperate to get into these studies that you're right, there's a big placebo effect. And there's another problem with these studies, which is that it's very hard to blind them, right? So a placebo, for it to work, you got to not know whether you got the active or the inactive treatment. A placebo is not going to give you a psychedelic experience. And if you gave somebody something that caused a psychedelic experience, it wouldn't be a placebo, because most of us think that the psychedelic experience is part of how these drugs work. It is a very difficult problem. When you look at these studies where people get a single dose of a psychedelic and feel better for a few months, there really aren't very many placebos that you can give people one dose of and they're going to feel better for 3 months or 6 months. And so that's probably the best data we have right now to suggest that it's probably something more than just a simple placebo effect, although certainly placebo factors are definitely playing into the treatment.
The reason for this lack of adequate research on psychedelics is partly due to what is known as US President Richard Nixon's war on drugs. This science spiel has a US history subplot.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
The drug war was started by Richard Nixon to keep hippies from voting. John Ehrlichman, one of his advisors, in an interview said, "We knew that psychedelics weren't dangerous, but all these Vietnam protesters were all smoking marijuana and taking acid. So we thought if we made these illegal, we could prosecute them and arrest them, then they would lose their right to vote." That was the basis for starting the drug war. The politics of that drug war has kept the research from advancing for 50 years.
Richard Nixon figures in this because he was the president at the time that when they introduced the Controlled Substances Act, which effectively banned research on psychedelics, that early that there was a lot of bad press given to these drugs. And there were a lot of investigators who had second thoughts about doing work on these drugs because of the potential damage to their reputation for working on a drug that was getting all this bad press in the media about its effects.
The first casualty in war is truth. The war on drugs politicized a health behavior. It would be like, we don't have like a war on fat people, like that's terrible, right? But it's okay to declare war on drug users, apparently. So it's a health behavior. And instead of talking about it through that framework and talking about the risks and benefits of a given behavior, we made it a crime. And we didn't study it. We only studied the negative effects. You couldn't get funding to go around and ask people like, what are the did anything good come out of your past psychedelic use?
From the way journalists have recently been reporting on psychedelic use as treatment for depression, it may sound like a push a button and cure your depression forever arrangement to the audience of these articles, but it's far from that. I'm going to go ahead and spoil the ending of this video for you. Unfortunately, the chances of you just doing some LSD at some random party and then magically being cured of your mental illness is very, very, very low. Most likely impossible. The studies conducted have shown that psychedelics do have an effect on some depression symptoms for some, but not all people. But the way these studies are then reported on to be made accessible to the layperson makes the process sound like a one and done deal. Like you can just go to your doctor and they'll give you a bag of magic mushrooms to use at home at your own leisure with no professional supervision at all, and then you never need to do anything else for your depression ever again. It fails to include the long procedure, the context, the intense supervision, and the resources that psychedelic therapy requires, which is partly why it is currently not being used as a mainstream method of treating depression.
These are drugs that are only being given for clinical purposes within the context of psychotherapy. So there's a non-drug preparatory therapy, there's the drug session, which the therapist will also be at, and then there's integration therapy that happens also without drug at the end of treatment. So they really are amplifiers to psychotherapy. They're not standalone treatments. Challenges of developing psychedelics as a therapy is that they're much more labor intensive, at least on the front end, than traditional treatments. So let's say you see a therapist every 2 weeks for an hour. Well, that's 26 hours a year. A course of psychedelic therapy is probably going to be somewhere on the order of 25 to 40 hours of concentrated clinical time. And if you have two therapists, it's really, arguably 80 to 90 hours. So it's much more of an upfront investment. When it works, ideally, is that people get well enough that they don't need ongoing treatment. Now that remains to be seen if that's going to be the case, but early results are promising, but need to be replicated in larger numbers to see if that stays. If we could actually cure people in psychiatry, which we historically have never been able to do, right now it's poised to put probably an enormous strain on the healthcare system because we hardly have enough therapists to do conventional therapy, let alone this kind of time-intensive psychedelic psychotherapies. The experience of psilocybin can be anxiety inducing for people. This is why we create so much psychological support and a container for that subject, because it's very common that people at some point during their 4 to 6 hours that they're under the effects of psilocybin will have some emotional distress. Failures of most journalism that I see in the science realm is it does not convey nuance very well. And so that, I think, is really the task to all science journalists, is to take this story and really be able to convey nuance to the general public, because science is full of nuance, but it doesn't make for good headlines. I see a lot of mediocre journalism in this space because journalists sometimes latch onto these sort of miracle cure narratives of one dose of magic mushrooms and his depression was gone. Okay, that may be true for that one patient. What about the other people? And what does gone mean?
There's people in the short term, people often reported benefits, but the longer you followed them, the less evident those benefits were. And at 6 to 12 months after treatment, you couldn't tell the difference when people had been given a psychedelic drug and people had been given some comparison treatment.
The list of the benefits of using psychedelics to treat depression seem to be endless and are reported on as such. It is very rare, however, to see the other side of the story, the harm and the dangers.
So there are certainly reports of people who've taken psychedelics in unsafe situations, and because they've moved into sort of the sort of psychedelic state, which is a little bit psychotic, they do things that are really stupid, like they become convinced they can fly, so they jump out the window, right? Now, in modern studies, of course, we don't allow this to happen. We have 2 people in the room with them at all times, and they're kept in a safe sort of environment. But so there are dangers that can happen while you're acutely in a psychedelic experience. And then there can be psychological harm from psychedelics. We've talked about how intense these psychedelic experiences can be. They can be very difficult for people sometimes, frightening, terrifying, emotionally heartbreaking if the material that comes up is very painful. And there are certainly people who are so overwhelmed by these experiences that they can develop a form of really almost post-traumatic stress disorder, where they've had an experience that completely freaked them out and scared the heck out of them. And that can mess you up. That can stay with you for a while. And so one of the important elements of psychedelic therapy, as it's being done in our studies, is we don't just give people the psychedelic experience and send them off. We meet with them afterwards for many hours and help them work through what happened to them and help them try to integrate that into their life to reduce that risk that they're going to have psychological damage if they had a difficult experience.
Much more than just the drug, because oftentimes the reporting really centers the drug. It will start off with party drug treats veterans trauma or something like that. It's like, no, therapy treats veterans trauma enhanced with this particular drug given in a very particular way. You can go get that same drug from somebody and take it and not get the same result, but that's not what's conveyed in the reporting. The implication is it's a drug that did the work.
Despite all this, common people and the industry that plans on distributing psychedelics alike perpetuate this belief that since psychedelics are natural, they're inherently safer and better for human consumption.
So there's a lot of products of natural plants and other things that have profound effects on human beings and human biology that are not always good. And I think there's this assumption that we make that if it's a herbal remedy, then it can't hurt you. And I think that's pretty naive. Opium poppy is a good example. The poppy itself has been known for thousands of years to have psychoactive effects on human beings. But we know that if that's treated in various ways and people get doses of naturally occurring substances in the opium poppy, it can kill them. Cocaine is pretty much the same. It's a pretty straightforward derivative of a naturally occurring plant. So the assumption that plant-based drugs are inherently safe, I think, is a nonsense, but it's a very prevalent nonsense.
2 of the psychedelics, mescaline and psilocybin, are natural products, and LSD is semi-synthetic. I don't know if there's any advantage to mescaline or psilocybin over something like LSD. LSD lasts for about the same length of time as mescaline. It's not as much, but as far as adverse reactions, I haven't seen anything that says one is safer than the other. There is a kind of a popular meme that says natural is better. I synthesized the psilocybin for the Johns Hopkins studies, and someone asked me once, well, is natural psilocybin isolate from mushrooms safer than synthetic psilocybin? I said, no, the atoms are hooked together in the same way. They're the same molecule. There's nothing inherently better about naturally produced psilocybin than synthetic.
All the psychedelics that will be approved by the FDA are not natural. They are synthesized just like any other antidepressant. So, for instance, in the studies that we're doing, we're using what's called GMP, good manufacturing practice, psilocybin. It has to be extremely pure. It's not made from mushrooms. It's made from an organic starting compound, just like Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, all other drugs. Now, there are some people that think that the natural products are superior because they're more complicated. There's an idea called entourage effects, which is that maybe the mushrooms, for instance, have other chemicals in them that we don't know about that are also helping out with their therapeutic effects. Our large extended group at USANA Institute has done a study where we've looked at every single chemical pretty much within mushrooms, and it really looks like psilocybin is the main chemical. So that would argue against this sort of entourage natural effect.
It's more a psychological thing, and for some people can be really profound. So there are people who really only want to take natural products, and I would be willing to bet you if you get someone who has that kind of mindset and you give them psilocybin that's been synthesized or the psilocybin that came from a mushroom, they will not be able to tell the difference. But if you tell them this is synthetic psilocybin and this is natural psilocybin, they will probably say, oh, then that's synthetic psilocybin. I didn't like that as well.
Psychedelic research is currently trapped in a hype bubble, meaning it has become overvalued in public perception thanks to the media and pharmaceutical industry. Psychedelics' reputation has gone through extreme highs and lows in the past century. Super enthusiasts believe they are nature's harmless miracle cure. Meanwhile, super skeptics believe they can cause nothing but harm. Both are incorrect. These extreme shifts in perception can stand in the way of research and reasonable clinical applications. This can be described through the Gartner hype cycle. It can also predict the drug's future.
Psilocybin is still probably 3 to 4 years away from being available in clinical use. And yet, from the amount of journalism that's being produced about it, you'd think it's going to be available tomorrow. People read these articles and they don't even realize that A, psilocybin is still a controlled substance, and B, it's not clinically available yet. Because, you read Michael Pollan's book or something and you'd think like, oh, I can just go down to Walgreens and get myself some psilocybin. And like, that's not how it works. So I appeal to journalists to bring a little more temperance to their reporting. Elated and effervescent headlines like such and such cures fill in the blank are very appealing, but they're misleading. The misleading aspect actually has the potential to cause harm. And it could cause harm in a number of different ways. One is it inflates expectations to the point at which if somebody gets one of these treatments and it doesn't work as well as they expect, they're going to be really distressed by that. And two, the other thing is it can cause people to go out and try this on their own in a context that's very different than what we're doing in research and very different than what we'll be doing in clinical work.
Well, I think the other thing that you should remember is that there was, for a very long period, psychedelics got an incredibly good press in the 1950s and 1960s. And we're going through exactly the same thing at the moment, with a lot of hype, a lot of hope, a lot of expectations about how they're going to transform the field of mental illness and its treatment, change society for the better and so on. We're seeing a bit of a repeat in some ways of what went on in the 50s and 60s. So we think that the late 1960s is when there was a lot of bad press about LSD. Throughout the early 60s, most of the press was incredibly positive. A large part of the problem with the work done in the 50s is there wasn't much of a tradition of research then, so a lot of it was what patients told doctors and what doctors wrote down and reported. So there wasn't a lot of systematic research on it. I think that's what's interesting about the current research on MDMA and post-traumatic stress disorder, because they are explicitly investigating that, and they're presenting pretty reasonable evidence that these drugs assist people too. When these drugs were first introduced, they were heralded as a brand new drug that was so much better than everything else, that really transformed the treatment of depression. And of course, the longer it's gone on, the clearer it's become that these drugs are not the wonder drugs that we thought they were. That these drugs do have a role. Some people do benefit from them, but by no means all. And there's usually a cost. There's a downside to using any drug for any treatment. There's adverse side effects, and that's been one of the difficulties in evaluating any drug treatment. If people go into a new treatment, there's a lot of hype and hope around it. The initial results of most treatments in the early trials look a lot better than they do sometime down the track.
Yeah, one of the really important questions that we haven't fully answered yet is, for whom do these treatments not work? Because every treatment doesn't work for everyone. Anybody who tells you a treatment works for everyone is lying to you.
The research we have at the moment seems to pose more new questions than it does answer old ones. What factors determine who psychedelics work on? Is there any way to control these factors? What would happen if antidepressants were included in the treatment post-psychedelic use? What effect will psychedelic use have on people whose depression stems from other psychiatric and personality disorders? There hasn't been much, if any, research conducted on these particular but crucial questions. Circling back to the question that started it all, can psychedelics cure depression? The answer is... There is no such thing as a cure for depression, only treatment. Can psychedelics treat depression then? For some people, in safe environments with extensive therapy. So I guess the answer is, if you're genetically gifted and rich enough to afford therapy, maybe? This might be anticlimactic, and you may even be disappointed. But I'd rather this video disappoint you than your doctor.